Let me ask you something, and don't answer too quickly. When was the last time you sat down with a single intention in your head, just one, and stayed with it long enough to see it through without drifting away? Not half finishing it, not pausing to check something real quick, not telling yourself you'll come back later. I mean really stayed. Because if you're honest, and most people are when the room is quiet enough, the answer doesn't come easily. It slips. It hesitates. It hides behind excuses that sound reasonable on the surface, but feel hollow underneath. People like to say they're busy, that life is demanding, that there's just too much going on. And sure, that's partly true, but that's not the whole story. The truth is much simpler and a little more uncomfortable. People today don't lose focus in big, dramatic moments. They lose it in small, quiet fragments. 10 minutes here, 5 minutes there, a glance at a screen that turns into a scroll that turns into a habit, and a habit that slowly rewires the way they think without them even noticing. It doesn't feel dangerous when it happens. It feels normal. That's the problem. You wake up, and before your feet even touch the floor, your hand already knows where to go. The phone is right there. No decision needed, just a reflex. You tell yourself it's just to check the time, maybe a message, maybe the news. But the moment the screen lights up, it's like opening a door to a room that never ends. There's always something new, something louder, something more urgent than whatever you plan to do with your day. And before you realize it, you've already given away the first piece of your attention. Not to something meaningful, not to something you chose with intention, just to whatever showed up first. And that pattern repeats itself in ways that are so subtle, they almost feel harmless. Sitting down to work, opening a laptop, telling yourself, all right, now I'll focus. But the brain doesn't switch like that. It doesn't forget the stimulation it just tasted. It keeps looking for it, like a tongue searching for sugar long after the candy is gone. So you open one tab, then another, then another. You tell yourself you're preparing, researching, getting ready. But deep down, you know you haven't really started, not in the way that matters. Because starting something real requires a kind of silence most people aren't used to anymore. It requires sitting with discomfort, with slowness, with the absence of immediate reward. And that's where things begin to fall apart. Not because people are incapable, not because they're lazy, but because they've been trained, day after day, year after year, to expect constant stimulation, quick hits, fast rewards, instant feedback. And when that becomes your baseline, anything that moves slower starts to feel wrong, heavy, unnatural. You begin to associate focus with effort, and effort with pain. So naturally, you avoid it, not consciously. You don't sit there and say, I choose distraction. It's quieter than that. It's automatic. Your attention just drifts, like a boat that was never anchored in the first place. And then comes the part that really sticks, the story people start telling themselves. Maybe I'm just not disciplined enough. Maybe I don't have what it takes. Maybe I'm just bad at focusing. These thoughts don't show up all at once. They build slowly, layered on top of each other, until they start to feel like facts instead of interpretations. And once you believe them, they shape the way you move through your days. You lower your expectations. You stop trusting your own ability to stay with something. You begin to expect distraction, almost like it's part of your identity. And that's where the real loss happens, not in the wasted hours, not in the unfinished tasks, but in the quiet shift of how you see yourself. Because when someone stops believing they can focus, they stop attempting things that require focus. They choose easier paths, shorter tasks, quicker wins. Not because that's what they truly want, but because it feels safer, more manageable, less likely to expose that uncomfortable gap between intention and action. And society, in its own strange way, reinforces this pattern. Everywhere you look, speed is praised. Multitasking is worn like a badge of honor. Being busy is treated as proof of value, even if that busyness produces nothing meaningful. People jump between conversations, apps, tasks, ideas, constantly moving, rarely arriving. And it looks productive from the outside. It even feels productive for a moment. But underneath, there's a kind of emptiness, a sense that nothing is really being held long enough to take root, like planting seeds and digging them up every few minutes to check if they've grown. And the strange part is, most people sense this. They feel the fragmentation. They notice how hard it is to stay present, to read a full page without drifting, to listen to someone without thinking about something else at the same time. But instead of questioning the environment that creates this, they turn inward and blame themselves. It's easier that way, cleaner. If the problem is me, then at least it's contained. At least it feels like something I can fix by trying harder. But trying harder in the wrong environment is like running on sand. You can push as much as you want, but you won't get very far. And over time, that constant pushing without progress becomes exhausting. People burn out not because they're doing too much meaningful work, but because they're constantly switching, constantly starting and stopping, constantly carrying the mental weight of unfinished things. It's like having dozens of tabs open in your mind, each one quietly draining energy, even if you're not actively looking at it. And so the cycle continues. Wake up, reach for the phone, drift through the morning, attempt to work, get distracted, feel guilty, promise to do better tomorrow, repeat, day after day, week after week, and eventually it starts to feel normal. That's the most dangerous part. When dysfunction feels normal, it becomes invisible. You stop questioning it, you adapt to it, you build your life around it. Shorter attention spans, quicker tasks, constant stimulation in the background, music, videos, notifications, anything to avoid that quiet space where real focus lives. Because that space feels unfamiliar now, almost uncomfortable, like silence in a room you're not used to being alone in. But here's the thing most people overlook. Focus isn't something you suddenly discover one day. It's not a switch you flip when you feel motivated enough. It's a condition that either exists in your environment or it doesn't. And right now, for most people, it doesn't. Not because they chose it that way, but because the world around them has been designed, very intentionally, to pull their attention in 100 different directions. Every app, every platform, every notification is competing for one thing, your time. And they're very good at winning. Not because they're smarter than you, but because they're built to be irresistible. Bright colors, endless scrolling, algorithms that learn what keeps you hooked. It's not a fair fight, and yet people step into it every day without realizing they're even in a fight. They think they're just taking a break, just checking something quickly. But those small moments add up. They shape habits, and habits shape identity. So when someone says, "I can't focus," what they're really saying, whether they realize it or not, is, "My life is structured in a way that makes focus almost impossible." And that's a very different statement, because one points to a personal flaw, the other points to a system that can be changed. But before anything changes, there has to be awareness. A moment where you stop and really look at how your attention is being used, where it's going, what it's feeding on. Not in a judgmental way, not with blame, just honestly. Because until you see the pattern, you'll keep repeating it, and it will keep costing you, not just in productivity, but in something deeper. Your ability to stay with your own thoughts, to sit with something long enough to understand it, to build something that actually matters. And maybe that's the real question worth asking. Not, why can't I focus? But, what kind of life have I built that makes focus so rare? He wasn't anyone you would notice in a crowd. If you passed him on the street, you wouldn't turn your head. He dressed simply, moved quickly, always seemed to be on his way somewhere, like most people who feel they're already late, even when they're not. His days followed a pattern so familiar it almost felt invisible. Alarm rings, hand reaches out, not to turn it off, but to pick up the phone. That small movement, repeated every morning, quietly decided the direction of his day long before he even sat up. At first he told himself it was harmless, just checking messages, just seeing what he missed while he slept. But just a minute had a strange way of stretching. One notification led to another. A message turned into a scroll. A scroll turned into a stream of videos, news, updates, fragments of other people's lives stitched together in a way that made his own feel slower, quieter, less urgent. By the time he finally got out of bed, something inside him was already scattered. Not broken, not exhausted, just pulled in too many directions at once. He didn't have the words for it, but he felt it, like trying to hold water in his hands. It slipped through, no matter how tightly he tried to close his fingers. He would sit at the edge of his bed for a second, staring at nothing, as if his mind needed to catch up with his body. Then he moved on, brushing his teeth while replaying things he had just seen, getting dressed while half thinking about something he planned to do, half thinking about something completely unrelated. There was no clean start to his day, just a continuation of noise. When he finally sat down to work, he carried that noise with him. The desk wasn't messy, but it wasn't intentional either. A few papers, a laptop, a cup of coffee that would go cold more often than not. He would open his computer with a kind of quiet determination, the same thought running through his head every morning. Today, I'll do it properly. And for a brief moment, it felt possible. He opened the file, looked at the task in front of him, and then something subtle shifted. Not dramatic, not obvious, just a slight resistance. Like the task was heavier than it should be. His mind hesitated. And in that hesitation, his attention slipped. A new tab opened. Not for distraction, he told himself. For something related, just to check one thing. But the moment that tab appeared, it was like a door opening again. Another piece of his focus walked out. Then another. Within minutes, he wasn't really working anymore. He was moving between things. A line here, a glance there, a quick check, a small pause. It looked like activity. If someone watched him, they would think he was busy. But inside, he knew the truth. He hadn't really started, not in the way that counts. Hours passed like that. Not wasted entirely, but not used either. And that middle space, where time disappears without leaving anything meaningful behind, slowly became his normal. By midday, the guilt would start to settle in. Not loud, not overwhelming, just a quiet pressure in his chest. A reminder that the day was slipping again. He would try to compensate, work faster, push harder, tell himself to focus. But effort alone didn't change anything. Because the problem wasn't effort. It was the way his attention had already been fragmented before he even began. Lunch came and went without much awareness. Sometimes he ate while watching something. Sometimes he scrolled without realizing how long he'd been doing it. There was always something filling the space. Silence felt uncomfortable now. Unnecessary, like a gap that needed to be covered. In the afternoon, the pattern repeated. Sit down, try again, get pulled away, return, drift, restart. Over and over, like a loop he couldn't quite break. And each time he failed to stay focused, a small thought crept in. What's wrong with me? He didn't say it out loud. He didn't even fully acknowledge it, but it was there, quiet, persistent, shaping the way he saw himself. By evening, he was tired, but not the kind of tired that comes from doing meaningful work. It was a different kind, a scattered tired. Like his energy had been spread too thin across too many things, none of them finished, none of them complete. He would look back at his day and struggle to point to anything solid. Something he could say, yes, I did that. And in that moment, he made the same promise again. Tomorrow will be different. Tomorrow, he would wake up earlier. Tomorrow, he would focus. Tomorrow, he would finally get it together. And for a while, he believed it. That belief carried him through the night. It gave him a sense of control, even if it was temporary. But the next morning, the same pattern waited for him. The same phone, the same reflex, the same slow drift into distraction before the day had even properly begun. And what made it harder was that, on the surface, everything looked fine. He wasn't failing in an obvious way. He met deadlines, barely. He completed tasks, eventually. From the outside, he functioned. That's what kept the cycle alive. Because there was no crisis forcing him to change. Just a quiet dissatisfaction that never quite reached the level of urgency. And that's how years can pass without real progress. Not because someone isn't capable, but because they're stuck in a pattern that feels manageable enough to tolerate. He started noticing small things. How often his hand moved toward his phone without thinking. How quickly his attention shifted when something more stimulating appeared. How difficult it felt to stay with a single task, even when he genuinely wanted to. It wasn't that he didn't care. It wasn't that he lacked ambition. It was something deeper, something built into the way he moved through his day. And yet, he kept approaching it the same way most people do, by trying to push harder, by telling himself to be more disciplined, by waiting for motivation to show up. But motivation is unreliable. It comes and goes without warning. And when it's gone, all that's left is the structure of your life. His structure wasn't built for focus. It was built for reaction, responding to notifications, switching between tasks, filling every quiet moment with something external. He didn't design it that way on purpose. It just happened, slowly, gradually, like habits tend to do. And once it was in place, it became his default, something he followed without questioning. Until one day, in the middle of another unfinished task, another distracted afternoon, something in him paused. Not dramatically, just a small moment of awareness. He looked at his screen, at the open tabs, at the half-done work, and for the first time, he didn't blame himself. He didn't say, "I need to try harder." He asked a different question. Why does this keep happening? That question didn't solve anything immediately, but it shifted something. It moved the problem out of his identity and into his environment. It gave him a different angle to look from. And once you see a pattern from the outside, even just a little, it becomes harder to ignore. He started noticing the triggers, the moments where his focus broke, the habits that led him there. Not with judgment, just observation, like watching someone else. And slowly, a realization began to form. This wasn't random. It wasn't a series of isolated failures. It was a system, a set of inputs leading to predictable outputs. And if that was true, then maybe, just maybe, it could be changed. Not by forcing himself to focus harder, but by changing the conditions that made focus so difficult in the first place. That thought didn't feel exciting. It didn't come with a surge of motivation. It felt practical, grounded, like something he could actually test. And for the first time in a long time, the problem didn't feel like a personal flaw. It felt like something he could work with, something he could understand, and maybe, eventually, something he could rebuild. The shift didn't come like a lightning strike. No dramatic morning, no sudden clarity where everything made sense at once. It came quietly, almost in a way that was easy to ignore. But this time, he didn't ignore it. That small question he asked himself, why does this keep happening, stayed with him longer than expected. It followed him through the day, sat with him while he worked, lingered in the background while he reached for his phone again and again. And slowly, he started seeing things he hadn't noticed before. Not new things, just things he had never really looked at closely. The way his hand moved before his mind caught up. The way his attention snapped toward anything that offered a quick reward. The way real work, quiet, slow, demanding, felt almost foreign, like something his brain resisted by default. And that's when the realization began to take shape. Not as an idea he read somewhere, not as advice someone gave him, but as something he experienced directly. He wasn't choosing distraction nearly as much as he thought he was. It was happening to him, automatically, like a reflex, like breathing. And that was unsettling, because if it was automatic, then effort alone wouldn't fix it. You can't fight a reflex with willpower every single time. Eventually, you lose. Not because you're weak, but because you're outnumbered. And that's when he saw it, the part most people miss. His environment wasn't neutral. It wasn't just there. It was shaping him. Every app on his phone, every open tab, every notification, every piece of content he consumed. It wasn't passive. It was active. It was training his brain to expect a certain rhythm. Fast, stimulating, constant. And once that rhythm became normal, anything slower started to feel wrong. He tested this idea in a simple way. One morning, instead of reaching for his phone, he left it on the other side of the room. Not as a big statement, just an experiment. When he woke up, the first thing he noticed wasn't peace or clarity. It was discomfort, a strange, restless feeling, like something was missing. His mind didn't know where to go. It kept searching, almost impatient. That alone told him everything he needed to know. It wasn't just a habit. It was dependency. Not in a dramatic, life-ruining sense, but in a subtle, everyday way that shaped how he experienced his own thoughts. He sat there for a moment longer than usual. No screen, no input, just silence. And it felt heavy. Not because silence is heavy, but because he wasn't used to it anymore. That was the twist, the thing he hadn't seen before. The problem wasn't that he couldn't focus. The problem was that he had trained his brain to avoid the very state that focus requires. Low stimulation, stillness, patience. Without those, focus has nowhere to exist. It's like trying to light a candle in the wind. You can keep trying, but it won't stay lit. That realization didn't make things easier right away. In fact, it made them a bit harder, because now he couldn't pretend anymore. He couldn't blame lack of discipline or wait for motivation. He had seen the mechanism behind his behavior, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. He began noticing how often he interrupted himself, not because something urgent came up, but because his brain was looking for an easier reward. He would start a task, feel a slight resistance, and almost immediately, his attention would reach for something else. not consciously, just automatically. And every time he followed that impulse, he reinforced the pattern. He was teaching his brain, over and over again, that discomfort should be escaped, not endured. That's when another piece fell into place. Focus isn't about doing more. It's about staying. Staying when it gets a little uncomfortable. Staying when the reward isn't immediate. Staying long enough for your mind to settle into the task instead of jumping away from it. But staying requires a certain environment, and his environment was working against him at every level. So he made a decision, not a big one, not something dramatic, just a shift in approach. Instead of trying to control his mind directly, he would control what his mind was exposed to. He started small, removed the phone from his workspace, closed every tab that wasn't necessary, reduced the number of inputs around him. Not perfectly, not all at once, just enough to notice a difference. And the difference was immediate, but not in the way people expect. It didn't feel easier, it felt quieter. And in that quiet, all the resistance he had been avoiding became visible. The urge to check something, the itch to switch tasks, the restlessness that builds when there's no constant stimulation to distract you from your own thoughts. Most people interpret that feeling as a sign that something is wrong, that they're not in the mood, not ready, not capable in that moment. But he started to see it differently. That discomfort wasn't a barrier. It was a signal, a sign that his brain was adjusting, detoxing from constant input, learning, slowly, to exist without needing something new every few seconds. It wasn't pleasant, but it was real. And for the first time, he wasn't trying to escape it. He was observing it, letting it pass without immediately reacting. That alone changed something fundamental. Because every time he resisted the urge to switch, even for a few seconds longer than before, he was weakening the old pattern. And over time, those small moments added up. He also noticed something else, something almost counterintuitive. The work itself hadn't changed. It was still the same tasks, the same responsibilities, but the way it felt began to shift. Not dramatically, not instantly, but slowly. As the noise around him decreased, the work became clearer, more defined, less overwhelming. It wasn't that the tasks were easier. It was that his mind wasn't being pulled in 10 different directions at once, and that made all the difference. He began to understand something deeper about attention. It doesn't respond well to force. You can't bully your mind into focus, but you can create conditions where focus becomes the natural outcome, where it doesn't require constant effort to maintain. That was the new reality he stepped into, not one where he suddenly became perfectly disciplined, but one where he stopped fighting the wrong battle. Instead of asking, how do I force myself to focus, he started asking, what is making focus so difficult right now? And that question led him to practical answers. Reduce stimulation, limit choices, remove distractions before they become problems, lower the friction to start, fix his work to specific times instead of waiting for the right mood. None of these ideas were revolutionary on their own, but together they formed something powerful, a system. And systems don't rely on how you feel in the moment. They operate regardless of motivation. That was the part that surprised him the most. He had spent so much time waiting to feel ready, waiting for the right mindset, the right energy. But readiness, he realized, is often just the result of repetition. Show up enough times under the same conditions, and your brain stops negotiating. It adapts. It learns what to expect. And once that expectation is in place, resistance decreases naturally. Not completely, but enough to move forward without constant struggle. This new perspective didn't make him perfect. He still got distracted, still slipped into old habits from time to time. But the difference was awareness. He could see it happening. And because he could see it, he could interrupt it. Not always immediately, but more often than before. And that gradual shift, from unconscious reaction to conscious choice, changed the trajectory of his days. What once felt like a personal flaw now looked like a pattern he had learned. And if it was learned, it could be unlearned, replaced, rebuilt. That's the part most people never reach. Not because it's complicated, but because it requires a different kind of honesty. The kind where you stop blaming yourself and start examining the systems you live in. Because once you do that, the problem stops being, why am I like this? And becomes, what have I been practicing every day without realizing it? And that question opens a very different door. At first, nothing about it felt like progress. If anything, it felt like he had made things worse. The silence he created around himself wasn't peaceful, not in the beginning. It pressed in on him. It exposed everything he used to avoid without even realizing it. When he sat down to work now, without his phone nearby, without tabs pulling at his attention, there was no easy escape, just the task and the weight of his own mind. He noticed how quickly discomfort rose to the surface. Not pain, not fear, just a low, steady resistance. The kind that whispers, "This is too much," even when it isn't. Before, he would have answered that whisper immediately, reaching for something to break the tension. Now, he didn't. Not because he was stronger, but because he had removed the option, and that changed everything. Because when you can't escape right away, you're forced to sit with what's there. And what was there surprised him. It wasn't the task itself that was difficult. It was the beginning, that first moment of contact, the point where intention turns into action. It felt like stepping into cold water. The mind pulled back, searching for warmth, for something familiar, something easier. He could feel it clearly now, the urge to delay, to adjust, to prepare just a little more before starting. And for the first time, he didn't follow it blindly. He watched it. He let it exist without obeying it. Seconds passed, then more. The urge didn't disappear immediately. It lingered, it pushed, but it didn't grow stronger. It just stayed. And then, slowly, something shifted. Not dramatically, just enough for him to take the first step. One small action. Opening the document, writing a line. Not because he felt ready, but because he had stopped waiting to feel ready. That was new, and it mattered more than he expected. Because once he crossed that invisible line between thinking and doing, the resistance began to change shape. It didn't vanish, but it softened. Like a door that feels heavy until you push it open, and then suddenly moves with less effort. He kept going. Not fast, not perfectly, just steadily. And for a while his mind stayed with him. Not completely still, but less chaotic than before. The noise had lowered. The constant pull toward distraction had weakened. And in that quieter space, he noticed something he hadn't felt in a long time. Engagement. Not excitement, not motivation. Just a simple, grounded connection to what he was doing. It felt unfamiliar, almost fragile, like something that could break if he looked at it too directly. But it was there, and it stayed, as long as he stayed. Minutes passed, then more. At some point, he realized he hadn't thought about his phone, hadn't checked anything, hadn't switched tasks. That realization didn't come with a rush of pride. It came with a kind of quiet surprise, like noticing you've been walking for a while without thinking about your steps. But the moment he became aware of it, the old patterns tried to return. The thought appeared, maybe I should take a quick break. Not because he needed one, but because that's what he was used to doing. Breaking the flow before it could deepen, interrupting himself before the work became too real. This time, he paused. Not to stop working, but to look at the thought itself. It wasn't urgent. It wasn't necessary. It was just familiar, and that made it powerful. He let it pass, went back to the task, and something deeper settled in. The kind of focus that doesn't feel forced, the kind that grows when there's nothing pulling it apart. He didn't stay there forever. Eventually, the session ended. The timer went off. He stopped, not exhausted, not drained, just finished. That feeling was new too. Not the end of the work entirely, but the end of a clear, uninterrupted stretch of effort. Something he could point to and say, I was there for that. It wasn't dramatic. No one saw it. No one praised it. But it mattered, more than he expected, because it gave him something real to hold on to. Proof that focus wasn't something he had lost. It was something he had been crowding out. And once he created space for it, it returned on its own. Not all at once, not perfectly, but enough to change the direction of his days. The next time he sat down, it wasn't easier in the way people imagine. The resistance was still there. The discomfort still showed up at the beginning. But now, he recognized it. It wasn't a sign to stop. It was part of the process, like the first few steps of a long walk. You don't question them, you just take them. And over time, something subtle began to happen. The gap between starting and settling grew shorter. What used to take 20 minutes of drifting now took 5, then less. His mind adapted, not because he forced it, but because he gave it consistent conditions. The same time, the same environment, the same expectation. Show up, stay, begin small, and let the rest follow. He also started noticing how his energy changed throughout the day, not in spikes and crashes like before, but in a steadier rhythm. Without constant switching, his mind didn't feel as scattered. Without endless input, it didn't feel as drained. There was more space between thoughts, more clarity. Not perfect clarity, just enough to think without being interrupted by something else every few seconds. And in that space, something deeper surfaced. Not just focus, but awareness. He became more conscious of how he moved through his day, how he responded to small impulses, how easily habits formed when repeated without attention. It wasn't about controlling everything, it was about noticing. And that noticing changed his relationship with himself. He stopped reacting automatically, started choosing, even in small ways, staying with a task a little longer, pausing before reaching for distraction, letting silence exist without filling it immediately. These weren't big actions, but they added up, quietly, consistently. And over time, the work itself began to feel different, not easier, but more meaningful, because he was actually present for it, not half there, not divided, fully engaged, even if only for short periods at first. And that changed the quality of what he produced. Not just the output, but the experience of creating it. It no longer felt like something he had to push through. It became something he could enter, something he could stay with long enough to understand. That's where the real shift happened, not in his schedule, not in his tools, but in the way he related to his own attention. He stopped treating it like something broken that needed fixing, and started treating it like something sensitive that needed the right conditions to function. Like a muscle that grows with use, but only if it's not constantly interrupted. Like a flame that stays lit, but only if it's protected from the wind. And once he understood that, everything slowed down. Not in a negative way, in a grounded way. He wasn't rushing between tasks anymore, wasn't trying to prove anything with constant activity. He worked, then stopped, focused, then rested. Not perfectly balanced, but more intentional than before. And in that slower rhythm, he found something he hadn't realized he was missing. A sense of control, not over everything, just over where his attention went. And that was enough, because attention shapes everything else. What you notice, what you build, what you become. He still had days where things didn't go as planned. Days where distraction crept back in, where focus felt harder to reach. But those days didn't define him anymore. They were just part of the process, temporary, not permanent, and that made them easier to recover from. He didn't start over every Monday. He continued from where he left off, adjusted, refined, kept going. That's the part most people don't see, the quiet repetition, the small decisions that don't look impressive but change everything over time. It's not about becoming someone completely different. It's about removing what's in the way of who you already are. And for him, what was in the way was noise, constant, unexamined noise. Once he reduced it, even slightly, something real had space to emerge. Not perfection, just presence. And that was enough to build on, enough to keep moving forward, one focused moment at a time. There's something people don't like to admit, even to themselves, that most of what shapes their life isn't the big decisions, not the dramatic turning points, not the moments they remember telling others about. It's the small things they repeat when no one is watching. The way they start their morning, the way they respond to a moment of discomfort, the way they treat their own attention when it begins to drift. And if you looked closely, really closely, you would see that focus, or the lack of it, is not an accident. It's a pattern, quiet, consistent, built over time. That man, he didn't become focused overnight. There was no single day where everything clicked and stayed that way forever. What changed was simpler, and maybe harder to accept. He stopped waiting to feel ready, stopped waiting for motivation to arrive like some kind of signal that now, finally, it was time to begin. He had spent years doing that, waiting for the right mood, the right energy, the right version of himself to show up. But that version never came. Not because it didn't exist, but because it doesn't work like that. Readiness isn't something that appears before action. It's something that grows because of action. And once he understood that, not as an idea, but as something he lived through, he made a quiet agreement with himself. Not a promise filled with emotion, not a dramatic declaration, just something simple. He would show up at the same time, do the work in front of him, and stay as long as he said he would. No negotiation, no checking if he felt like it. No adjusting based on mood, just showing up. And at first it felt mechanical, almost empty. There was no excitement in it, no sense of inspiration, just repetition. But repetition has a strange power. It teaches the brain what to expect. And once the brain knows what to expect, it stops resisting as much. Not completely, but enough to make movement possible without constant struggle. That's what people misunderstand about discipline. They think it's about forcing yourself every single day, pushing against resistance forever. But real discipline, the kind that lasts, is quieter than that. It's about removing the need to decide over and over again. It's about making something automatic, not through habit alone, but through consistency in environment and timing. He didn't ask himself anymore, "Do I feel like focusing today?" That question had led him nowhere. Instead, he replaced it with something more grounded. It's time. That was it. And that small shift changed the way his days unfolded. Because once something becomes tied to time instead of emotion, it becomes more stable, less dependent on how you feel in the moment. And over time, that stability builds trust. Not the kind of trust you get from others, but the kind you build with yourself. The kind that says, when I say I'll be there, I'll be there. That trust doesn't come from big wins. It comes from showing up on days when nothing feels special, when there's no motivation, no excitement, just the decision to continue. And as that trust grew, something else followed, a different relationship with his work. Before, work was something he had to push himself into, something that felt distant, heavy, easy to avoid. Now, it became something more neutral, not always enjoyable, not always easy, but no longer something he needed to fight just to begin. And in that neutrality, there was freedom. Freedom from the constant internal battle. Freedom from the cycle of starting and stopping, promising and delaying. He didn't think about focus as a goal anymore. He saw it as a byproduct, something that emerges when the conditions are right, when distractions are limited, when the starting point is clear, when the time is fixed, when the environment supports rather than competes. That's the lesson most people miss. They chase focus directly, like it's something they can grab if they try hard enough. But focus isn't something you chase. It's something you allow. You create space for it. You remove what interferes with it. And then it shows up on its own. Not perfectly, not every time, but enough to matter, enough to build something real. And that's where the deeper question begins to take shape. Not, how do I focus more? But, what am I doing every day that makes focus harder than it needs to be? Because once you ask that question honestly, the answers are usually not complicated. They're just uncomfortable. The phone you reach for without thinking. The noise you keep around to avoid silence. The habit of switching tasks the moment something feels difficult. The tendency to wait for the perfect moment instead of working with the one you have. These things don't look like problems on their own, but together they create a life where focus has no place to exist. And changing that life doesn't require a complete overhaul. It starts with something small, something almost insignificant, removing one distraction, setting one consistent time, lowering the barrier to start. Just one step, not to finish everything, just to begin. That's where momentum comes from. Not from thinking about the whole journey, but from taking the first step without making it heavier than it needs to be. He learned that the hard way, by trying to do too much at once, by overwhelming himself with expectations, by turning simple tasks into mountains in his mind. And once he stopped doing that, once he made the starting point smaller, everything else became more manageable. Not easy, just possible. And that's enough, because progress doesn't need to be dramatic to be real. It just needs to be consistent, quiet, repeated, day after day. That's how change happens, not in bursts of motivation, but in steady movement, in small decisions that don't feel important in the moment, but shape everything over time. So if you're sitting there, listening to this, wondering why your focus feels so fragile, so unreliable, maybe don't look at yourself first. Look at your days. Look at the structure, the inputs, the habits you've repeated so many times they've become invisible. Because that's where the answer is. Not in trying harder, but in seeing clearly. And once you see clearly, you don't need to force as much. You just need to adjust. Slowly, intentionally, one piece at a time. And maybe that's the only thing worth asking yourself right now. Not how to become perfectly focused, but what is one small change you can make today that would give your attention a little more space to breathe. Not tomorrow, not next week, today, because that's where it starts. always, in the present moment. In a decision so small, it almost feels like nothing. And yet, it changes everything if you repeat it long enough. And if this path feels familiar to you, if you see yourself somewhere in that story, in those patterns, in that quiet struggle, then don't walk away from it too quickly. Stay with it. Explore it. And if you want a place where these conversations continue, where these small shifts are shared and built over time, then stay connected, not as a follower, not as a number, but as someone who's choosing, little by little, to live with more awareness, more intention, and maybe a little more control over the one thing that shapes it all, your attention.